has been started in 2009 in the case of China, and consider human rights as divisible. They always consider socio-economic rights as priority rather than the civil and political rights. So, for example, they have this clear prioritization of the socio-economic rights. Their way of considering human rights has been of huge debate in the global platform also, because they consider human rights as a Western concept, and they said that human rights in the Asian context is different. There is a differences of Asian values and human rights. Now, at least they have accepted the universality of human rights from 2009 onwards. That's something of a positive sign that we should take into account. But still, they have not signed, or they have signed but not ratified the civil and political rights. So they have been prioritizing the socio-economic rights of the people. They always promoted the hierarchy of socio-economic rights as primary, and the civil and political rights as a secondary. And they don't accept the universal concept of human rights with regard. They say that you cannot have the same system of human rights with every country. There should be differences according to their nature of their history, culture, and traditions. And second is development paradigm. Now again, it's all are related in the sense that they have created this development paradigm in the sense and have this solidarity with the developing world. They said that human rights cannot be same everywhere. It should be evaluated according to its level of development in that particular country. So that means you cannot have same system of human rights everywhere. Although that sometimes have the backing of the developing world and also of some repressive regimes who have been downplaying the human rights and promoting development agenda as a primary target. And then the other thing is the focus on the rights of the many, in the sense that they consider collective rights of its people and the state as primary and the individual rights as secondary. Now this is the stand that they have been taking for quite long, in the sense the state has a duty to protect its people as a community, but they have not categorically stated like not giving individual rights, but in the sense that they have always promoted the rights of many people compared to the individual rights. Now the next one is stability as precondition for the development rights. They always have this, rhetoric that state stability is primary, and even they have used this excuse during the Tiananmen killings that state's interests are primary, none of those separatist activities or those other elements in the society. Then now one more is the tactically usage of economic might. Now they have been using this economic might in every bilateral or multilateral meetings, and then negating the importance of human rights in terms of trade deals, or as we all know that China has been playing major roles in Europe or in US in 2008, and now in Europe with the economic recession. Now, next part is, now where does situation in Tibet stand in all this messy global affairs? UN General Assembly passed resolution in 1959, 61 and 65 to respect the human rights of Tibetans, and even stated the self-determination of Tibetans should be respected in 1961 and also in 1965. But at the same time, we need to consider that at that time, PRC, as in People's Republic of China, was not a member of General Assembly. So sometimes we think that now that was some victory, and not now. At that time, PRC was not a member. And even the UN Human Rights Commission, or Commission on Human Rights, passed resolution in 1991. And because 1991 was a period, late 90s, 89, after the Tiananmen killing, there was a huge setback for China in the Human Rights Commission, and there were several resolutions passed, and even one passed for Tibet. And in 1995 there was another attempt, but at that time, as I told you earlier, after the 1991, late 90s, they began to assert itself as a major player in the global affairs, more so in the human rights system, UN system, and particularly human rights system. And now, with more assertive China and smart usage of its economic powers, Western countries fail to raise Tibet issue at the appropriate level. Now, this is a fact in the sense that now, because of the economic might that China have, it is very difficult embarrassing for some state leaders to express its concern for Tibet. That's unfortunate, but it's a reality. And besides that, as a researcher, I felt that it's not only economic might, but other states, especially the US, UK, are dependent on China on key other issues. They bargain each other in the sense that, okay, you support me on North Korea, I won't raise something like it. Not deliberately, but there is a bargaining going on. You support me on Libya, and I won't. You don't veto this motion in the Security Council, I will support something like that in return. So these are something that bargaining goes on. That's a global politics, as we all know. And another thing is there's a lack of coordination among the Western countries to press China. Some leaders say something and some other leaders, they're not prepared, there's no coordinate, there's no planning in the sense to how to raise not only the Tibet issue, but Uyghur and other ethnic minorities, Falun Gong practitioners. There's no coordinated effort by the Western countries. And then China's principle of non-interference, sovereignty, stability, that's rhetoric has been playing for so long that everyone knows, but at the same time has been now, sometimes they have been pressing for so long that now people are beginning to understand and accept that notion of non-interference, and especially the backing of some of the developing countries and the huge investments in Africa. So there's a very grim chance in the UN General Assembly supporting, and sometimes it has become a reality in the sense that non-interference, sovereignty and state stability are in fact more important. Now, at the end of the day, is human rights a reality? Can we achieve human rights? Not only in China, but around the world. So basic thing is there is a lack of political will in terms of, for example, in China, there is no political will to respect the human rights. There is not a single leader came out and spoke for reform, unless once or twice in the former Prime Minister, Premier Wen Jiabao talked about reform, but no concrete will from the Chinese leadership. And there's a because of that, there's a weak institutional framework. There's no proper grievances. You cannot have, if you have grievances, there's no place to go, where to go, and there's a lack of access to justice. It's all the communist cadre or communist party members or communist leaders who just appoint directly to the judges. So there's a lack of access to justice. There's no independence of judiciary, and there's a opposition to human rights abroad. Now, one thing is because of its own human rights record, they indirectly encourages the human rights abuses in other countries, whether it's in North Korea, in Sudan, or in Iran. So sometimes it's becoming a trend that you don't oppose the human rights situation violations abroad, so you can abuse his rights in your own country. Now, another thing is China's strategy to put socio-economic rights ahead of civil and political rights will lead other repressive regime and developing countries to follow suit. Now that's something that majority of the developing countries are now claiming that, okay, leave aside human rights, first we need to have economic rights. So this is the concept that I talked earlier about human rights being indivisible. So they have been saying human rights can be divided in terms of socio-economic rights and civil and political rights, whereas the rights groups or every majority of the other Western countries claim the universality of human rights and human rights being indivisible. And what next for China? Now China's rise in the global affairs and in the UN human rights system can be summarized into being indifference to engagement to dominance. Now first, when they entered the United Nations system and the UN Human Rights, at that time Commission Human Rights, and then the Human Rights Council, they just become observer, they didn't take stand. Now, and after their rise because of the economic rise, they started engaging more, and then now they are being dominant in the global politics and playing their economic might in dictating terms in other countries' foreign affairs. And it can be summed up as they will always play their games accordingly as seen in the past, because when you look back into their foreign policy in terms of UN human rights system, it's not, except for the non-interference, there have been so many changes. And they have been actively engaging with the UN system, but with caution. And unlike some of the other countries, China has been very active in the UN Human Rights Council. They are very receptive of the questions, but at the same time they give answers, but still they are engaging with the UN system. And most importantly, it will depend on the world economic order. Now that's a reality, and actions of its own Chinese citizens in the mainland. Now these two will, if these two changes, then there would be a huge change in the Chinese approaches toward the human rights. Now, falling prey to Chinese bargaining trick, that's not understandable, but we all know it's reality. And also one other thing is Chinese preference to bilateral dialogue than multilateral dialogue. We all know that, because when it comes to the Southeast China Sea, South China Sea, all those affected areas, they want to have a bilateral dialogue with China, but China doesn't seem to be too interested in the same. And they have been always trying to have a bilateral dialogue, not multilateral dialogue, because at that time they can use their own, might, force, in the sense that you can have trade agreements with me, or do you want to have agreement with me or no one else, or something like that. So that's why China has been avoiding multilateral dialogue more than ever. I think that's it as of now. If you have any questions or any clarity, or if I'm being too fast. Yeah.
Could you relate some of what you've said, particularly since the 2009 review, to the situation with Tibet, and how Tibet may have been, the issues of Tibet may have been raised in the Human Rights Council, and what was China's response and other nations' response?
In 2009, interestingly, after the economic recession in the US, there were quite good support in respect to Tibet's issue during the UPR, Universal Periodic Review. That's what you're referring to, 2009. And at that time, many of the countries raised so many issues and also recommended so many proposals or ways to improve the human rights situations in Tibet, particularly some European countries, Czech Republic, Australia, and New Zealand, Poland, so many other countries, UK, US. They raised important issues, but at the same time, all the recommendations were, they didn't accept the recommendations. But at the same time, they have issued this National Human Rights Action Plan in 2009. And when you look into that action plan, it has been quite clear in the sense that there have been, again, the rhetoric that all the ethnic minorities enjoy the equal rights. There have been, freedom of religion to practice and believe in one's religion. So there has been rhetoric going on, but the thing is, the situation has worsened rather than to improve. So that's why the UPR session this October is vital in the sense to held accountable to its own pledges that was made in the action plan. That's something that we didn't ask you to do that, but you just said you will do that. So why don't you? So that's something that we want to hold accountable to with regard to China's review. And unfortunately, I don't know how this would turn up in the real sense that in the UPR session in October, but we are still working hard toward it in raising those issues.
And let's say those issues are raised, and the Chinese Human Rights Action Plan in relation to Tibet, the rhetoric on the equality of ethnic minorities has not been good, the issue has not been good, and then these countries, Australia, US and so on, make recommendations again, and then the Chinese say, okay, we don't accept your recommendation. Is there any system in the Human Rights Council that can force the issue with China, or they just say, oh, well, it's in process?
Now, there's a working group after the UPR which compiles all the recommendations, what they do, and then they have to report it to the UN Human Rights Council. At the end of the day, there's these 47 countries from across the world divided equally among the regions, which have the final say what actions will they take. Now, from some quarters of the human rights activists, they sometimes raise issues with aiming or doubting the credibility of the whole system. Now that sometimes, I don't know whether it can be correctly said, whether it's black or white, but there is sometimes question raised in the sense that what next? That's what you are raising. So at the end of the day, there's 47 member countries in the UN Human Rights Council who has the last say, and as a responsible state, they have the last moral obligation to do so, especially with regard to Human Rights Council, because when you enter the Human Rights Council or you stand in for the election to be a member of the Human Rights Council, you have to make pledges, or you have to promise, and you have to show your record that your human rights record is good. Even China's this year is not the member of the Human Rights Council, but it's coming up next year. So these elections also gonna held in November in New York in UN General Assembly, where China would appear herself as a candidature for the next Human Rights Council, and that's also an opportunity for other countries to, raise these issues or stop China from being a member of the UN Human Rights Council. But unfortunately, China is the lone candidature from Asia at this time, so that's automatically, I guess.
The only one.
Yeah. There's no rival candidature.
I was wondering if you could speak to if there's any difference between Xi Jinping's regime and Hu Jintao, and maybe it seems the situation in Tibet is just as bad, but maybe in mainland China, if there have been any changes.
I don't know, it's a bit early to comment on it, but at the same time, I don't know about the reform being, proposed, but at the same time, there is this resurgence of patriotic towards your communism. That's something that I don't see very good sign, because they have been trying to build better communist party, how you strengthen your party membership. That's something that is normally against the human rights mechanism that we hope for. So that's not a good sign that I see. And with regard to other reforms, I haven't heard or seen anything, concrete, plans or any action plans. Unlike in past, when Premier Wen Jiabao spoke about reforms, there was, at least he's the premier of the People's Republic of China. There was a good sign at that point of time, but as of now, it's too early to comment on that. But there's one thing is there is this plan of strengthening their party, so that's something not a good sign, I presume.
But they did make education reforms, didn't they, with allowing more Chinese students to study in the States? They signed an agreement. I think like 10,000 students can study in America. Is that?
I think in US it's already the largest number of foreign students is Chinese, so I'm sure there have been lots of Chinese students there. But I don't know concretely about what you raised.
How does it affect you when, say, I'm Australian, our foreign minister went to Beijing 2 weeks ago and said very supportive comments for Tibet, which would have been very uplifting. But on his personal blog, he says the exact opposite. How does that affect the confidence of Tibetans and the Tibetan parliament working with foreign countries?
Oh, that's strange in the sense sometimes people make some worst statements in an official capacity while personal level they support it, right? Right now it's opposite, I guess. So personal blog, he says that complete opposite of it.
Yes, he called His Holiness a cunning monk and said that it's not in Australia's interest to go down this line. He has modified the blog a number of times since we harangued him in 2010, and the blog has been written, but it's still unbending. He runs, the foreign minister was responsible for running large conferences to increase Chinese investment in Australia, Chinese immigration to Australia, etc., etc. So he's obviously got a monetary interest in all of this. He's not my choice of foreign minister, and perhaps when the Australian government changes, that's going to be said. But how does it affect Tibetan morale when this sort of duplicity happens?
Frankly, at a personal level, I'm quite used to it. So it doesn't mind or pull me back working towards what I'm doing right now. So it doesn't surprise or sometimes affect me in my work. As far as there are always majority of the global community, not excluding the governments, there have been huge support for the His Holiness vision of having this democratic, autonomous, as we call it, middle way path to have the genuine autonomy in Tibet. And this has been supported by almost so many people. That's something that I take in rather than taking those small issues to bog me down.
Can I ask you just one second question? On the bigger picture, China has never been held accountable for nearly 80 million deaths since World War II. Is there any way of the United Nations calling for accountability for this party that is currently being strengthened? I mean, I realise human rights abuses and secret human rights abuses and corruptions exist everywhere, all over the world. But, this is a very blatant piece of history. But there's never been any accountability for this?
Unfortunately, or technically, probably not. But there is this complaint procedure also in the UN system where if you can prove a consistent pattern of gross human rights violation, you can be held accountable.
Yeah.
And there's a working group on communication, working group on situations goes up to the UN General Assembly, Human Rights Council. That's one thing. And another is, there is another theory that's coming up more recently, is responsibility to protect. It's a notion that, again, it has to be passed unanimous by the UN Security, permanent member of the Security Council, where if there's a gross human rights violation, or gross in the sense that there's a genocide, ethnic cleansing, crime against humanity, then the other country has the responsibility to protect those people and intervene. So that's something, that new concept is coming up, but it's still at the very initial stage. And something like this was, I don't know whether you can propose this in that R2P, we call it, as responsibility to protect in Libya. But the Libyan case is a bit different. But this theory is coming up. So we have seen in the past the failure of preventing genocide in Rwanda, where there's enough evidence of it. So the global community at the larger level have thought about it as a responsibility to protect principle, but it still is a very initial stage. But other than that, I don't see any mechanism, or you can file a case in International Criminal Court or ICJ, but ICJ's case, you have, a state has to sponsor a case, so ICC you can do so, but still it's very complicated, and China is not a member of ICC in the sense International Criminal Court. China is not a member, so it's very difficult. So.
I think China does whatever they want concerning Tibet. Last year, Austria and Austrian, we invited the Dalai Lama for a speech, and also the Norwegians did. So we were both forbidden to enter Tibet out from Nepal, for instance, last year, because we invited the Dalai Lama and nobody could do anything. You see, I did what they want.
That's something now. Global community is also sometimes begin to getting used to it, but at the same time it's important never to get used to these things, and especially in European countries, the people's role in the changing the government policy, not exactly the foreign policy, but at least to receive His Holiness, the people does have a huge say in the, I see, especially in European countries and Australia.
I just wanted to go back on Kerry's point and what I was trying to get at a minute ago. It's like you said, there is an accountability. But my concern is that a lot of effort may be put into raising the issues of Tibet for this upcoming review. And even though there may be glaring human rights abuses with regard to Tibet and maybe some other minorities, at the end of the day, even those 47 countries on the Human Rights Councils can raise their objections, but in the end of the day, what really can be done? I think historically the UN has been seen to have no teeth in making particularly big countries accountable, where they have economic sway and political sway like China. So even though the effort might go into raising those issues, really at the end of the day, what can be done to be held China accountable?
Unlike during the Tiananmen killings, when they were having arms embargo and economic sanctions, That's not going to happen at all. But then one thing that can happen is passing resolutions, because sometimes at the international fora, it is very important to China's might have this economic might, but at the same time they need respect from the global community. That's evident from what they have been doing in the UN system. They have been actively participating. They have been, especially in the Human Rights Council. So if one can able to pass a resolution against China on those matters, that's a huge setback for China in the global, So that's something realistically, possible. And the other thing is, one thing is that that Tibet issue is rarely being raised in Human Rights Council, is because China has been very active in the UN Human Rights Council participation. They have a huge delegation, present report. So sometimes it's because if one country wants to raise an issue, they have to have this will or sincerity. But sometimes it's just for the sake of it they raise it, and so China's come with this huge replies. So it's very difficult to raise issue of Tibet, but it's also possible also. Yep.
It's been so the international pressure or international interference. It's been the major topic here, but you mentioned something about national pressure, so internal pressure from the Chinese people. In what shape do you see this? Do you see this coming, and do you see this as a possible solution?
Yeah, that's what when at the end of the presentation, it's written as I've stated. Unless if there is a change in world economic order, and there is a change inside China. Now, China has been focusing a lot on economic development and alleviating millions of Chinese from poverty, and at the same time they have to know that reality that people have access to information. This is something that China fears most, but at the same time this is something that getting very rapidly growing inside China. So because when I was in US, I have lots of Chinese students, not friends but Chinese students, but I try to talk to them, and they have this blanket of coverage of news agencies or news coverage inside China. So when they come out, as one of you raised about Chinese students being in the US, number of Chinese students increasing. So that's also one window of opportunity, in the sense that lots of informations are coming in. Lots of people are seeing beyond what the Communist Party is serving them. So this is something that because there's huge protests going inside China that no one knows. So once this goes on as a larger scale, so I think there is a chance in changing the situations inside China, also in other ethnic minority areas.
Just to continue with that, last year, just on a personal note, I was travelling around Amdo and Kam area by myself, and I'd been here beforehand, and I had a blog, and I had something about self-immolation, something about Dalai Lama, and the whole time I was in China, my blog was blocked. I mean, their filters are so good that anything that's related to a Tibetan issue will be blocked. And if we think about the number of Chinese who may go out as international students to the US or Australia or Europe, it's only a small percentage. And so their impact once they go back, if they go back, is going to be so limited. So even though we have the internet, etc., the educated Chinese people I spoke to, they weren't aware of what was going on in Tibet.
Yeah, that's also true. I just citing one example of that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, more so it's happening inside China. They have access to internet. I know, but there's restricted. But still, you can still overcome the censor. There are so many Chinese dissidents who do that, and at the same time, it's also important to realize that China is still developing. There are lots of middle class people. They don't care about what's going at the top level. Unless you are educated, you are just well off, then they have this interest about global peace, human rights of other ethnic minorities. Unless those middle class comes up, majority of them comes up, and then they have the luxury to, sometimes to care about other people, then sometimes I think will change dramatically, unless, because there's lots of middle class people who has been striving, and there's this huge economy boom, booming inside China, and they're all going after it. So once they reach some certain level and then realize, then they care about peace, non-violence, human rights, then something would change, I guess. But this is, I think, very possible.
Just in the interest of balance, was it breaking the United Nations statutes or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to assassinate Obama, because America is the largest supporter of Tibet? So Obama had no trial, of course, etc., etc. Osama bin Laden, sorry, not Obama. Osama, sorry, brain gap. But
It's like
you know,
Fox News.
does this influence how China works on the human rights level?
Sorry,
Does this sort of event affect how China sees the United Nations?
sometimes it's very, disturbing to see, because there's also, even the killing of Osama has been debated among the human rights activists, because whether he was armed or not, whether the US armies have security forces can arrest him or not. So there's this big question that is going on. And apart from that, the checking of mobile phones or spying on, that's something that is very discouraging, or sometimes, because you look up to some people which liberty, human rights, equality, then personal freedom of expression, in European countries and US, then again you suppress those individual liberties. Then that's you give brownie points to the Chinese to do the same thing. Then now that's something, as a human rights researcher here, as a Tibetan human rights researcher, I follow that very closely, in the sense that that's not I wished it happened, And also, because I didn't touch much on the Tibet issue, because I wanted to make it more China specific, so that because since you're all in Dharamsala, you've been hearing a lot of the Tibetan issue from everyone, so that's why I thought it would be good to just give overview of China's engagement towards Tibet. UN.
Alright, so before we conclude, I would like to, on behalf of Museum Section, Department of Information and International Relations, I would like to thank Mr. Namgyal, Head of UN, EU and Human Rights Desk in Department of Information and International Relations, for coming here and giving this presentation and sharing your valuable information with us. And I also would like to thank each and every one of you for coming here and participating in this talk session and making this a very interactive session. And as a token of appreciation, I would like to present to him a white scarf. Light refreshment ready there. So thank you. Thank you so much. He did his law degree from Pune, and he also got an opportunity to do his LLM in American University, Washington College of Law. And today he will be speaking on United Nations and China, its role and obligation to the United Nations human rights mechanisms. And this session will be presentation will be for half an hour and will be followed by questions and answers. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Namgyal. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I want to welcome everyone, and I also want to thank Tibetan Museum for inviting me. And first of all, I want to talk a bit about my work that I do in the UN, EU and Human Rights Desk of the Department of Information and International Relations at CTA based in Dharamsala. Basically, our work is to monitor and research on the human rights situations inside Tibet, and more importantly, to report it to the UN Human Rights Council sessions and EU-related agencies, and to government foreign ministries through our offices of Tibet. Now, Tibet Museum asked me to speak on the United Nations and any topic that I wanted to speak on. So I chose this topic because China, being a major player in global world affairs these days, and more importantly, China has been for this year, China is not a member of UN Human Rights Council. And also in October, the UPR session that I'll talk more later is coming up for review with regard to China's human rights record. So I thought it's important not only for Tibetans, but also for the everyone to look at China's record and how do they approach the UN, specifically with regard to the UN human rights mechanisms. First of all, I guess many of you know the UN, United Nations. After the failure of the League of Nations to prevent the violence and the Second World War, the world order has changed after the Second World War. So many new countries emerged, and many of the major players came together in San Francisco and formulated the Charter of the United Nations, which was signed. And this is the foundational treaty, foundational charter, and formed the international organization that we know as the United Nations in 1945. At that time, 50 of the nations, plus one, that is Poland, which was not present in the meeting, so Poland entered a few months later. So 51 of them got together and signed this treaty and created the United Nations. As of today, we have 193 independent states in the United Nations. And since there was this lack of credibility, lack of efficiency with the League of Nations, and the World War II, the main aim of the United Nations is to maintain peace and international security and respect the human rights. Now, one important thing is the United Nations, to maintain peace and international security, is mostly dealt by the UN General Assembly and more so by the UN Security Council. And but with regard to the respect and promotion of human rights, the need for another mechanism or system was felt, and so the Commission on Human Rights was set up right after that in 1946. And so this is actually the key moments in the history of international human rights law, how it emerged. Then we have this Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Then we have General Assembly Resolution 1514, which is important in the sense that it was a declaration for the forming of independent nations from the colonial era, out of the colonial period. And then we have this another treaty, International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1965. And then we have International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and another important one is International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So I won't go into deep because it's very technical in a sense, and we will touch more on the Chinese version, how they perceive it. And then we also have the General Assembly Resolution 2625, because it is important because the declaration forms the ground principle with regard to the self-determination of a distinct people. So that's, I thought, is important in the form of history of international human rights system. If you have any questions in between, if it's not clear, just raise and stop me. I want to make this in an interactive session. And now, with regard to the human rights system, the most important international, we call it International Bill of Rights. It's basically the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a declaration which has no binding obligations on the states. So, the creation of international civil and political rights and international covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights was felt, and from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, two treaties were created. Now these are Now I'll talk more with regard to the treaty-based mechanism. These are treaties. That means those states who sign and ratify has only the obligations to follow these treaties. As in the human rights system, we have two main bodies in the sense charter-based mechanisms and treaty-based mechanisms. Charter-based mechanisms is mostly formed from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whereas treaty-based mechanisms are all those treaties as in ICCPR, ICESCR, and the elimination of racial discrimination. These are all treaties which are cannot be enforceable unless the state parties ratifies it. And then we have regional mechanisms. Unfortunately, Asia doesn't have a sound regional mechanism, whereas Americas, Europe, and even Africa has a good, it's developing in the Africa. We have America's Commission on Human Rights and European Commission on Human Rights. We even have very functional European Court of Human Rights. Now, just to give you a brief overview of the UN Human Rights Council. Now, as I've talked about UN Commission on Human Rights, it was set up in 1946, but there were so many instances where the gross violators of human rights became the member state of the UN Commission on Human Rights, and more so sometimes became the president of the UN Commission on Human Rights. So there was the unanimous majority of the General Assembly felt the need to change the UN Commission on Human Rights and set up a new body which is called the UN Human Rights Council. And it was established in March 2006 by the General Assembly to replace the UN Commission on Human Rights. And it has presently 47 member states. And earlier, gross violators cannot be removed from the UN Commission on Human Rights, but now gross violators can be removed by 2/3 majority of General Assembly. And its main aim is to promote, coordinate, monitor, and mainstream human rights internationally and within the UN system. Now, for an average human being, average citizen around the world, if they have any grievances against the state policy or any related to human rights abuses, the first approach towards the UN basically is towards the UN Human Rights Council. So, under the UN Human Rights Council, we have special procedures, which is very important, and another mechanism which evolved recently is universal periodic review that I'll talk a bit later. Now, under the special procedures, now we have two bodies in the sense one is country mandates and the thematic mandates. Now, country mandates are basically you appoint an independent expert based on the situation within a country. For example, you appoint a special rapporteur on the case of Sudan or Sri Lanka. It depends. Whereas thematic mandates is based on the theme around the world. For example, we have 8 on civil and political rights. For example, we have a special rapporteur on torture, special rapporteur on summary executions, likewise freedom of expression, and also we have 8 on economic, social, and cultural rights. Again, it has been divided within the civil and political rights and economic and social and cultural rights. And we have 9 on specific groups. And also we have another working group, independent experts working on specific area of concern like arbitrary detention, enforced and involuntary disappearances, mercenaries, and African descent. Now next is what's the role of the special procedures. For example, if there's a special rapporteur on torture, what's his role? He accepts urgent appeals from individual, from group of people, or any NGOs. Then, if possible, he makes country visits. Now, it is sometimes people accuses UN of its failure to implement its mechanisms, but it's also on the part of the member states to receive the visits, because and at the end of the day, if, for example, special rapporteur on torture wanted to visit China, if China doesn't welcome it or invite the rapporteur, he cannot do so. So, if it all goes well, then the follow-up on the actions taken by the state takes place. Then normative work, which is not really technically in terms of legal sense, but norms that have been created in the past, and to follow up or work in the normative divisions and produce annual reports and submit it to the Human Rights Council. So these are the key responsibilities of the special procedure. Now next is universal periodic review. This is something of interest to many NGOs and citizens, human rights defenders, because this is a periodic review. It was started in 2006 after the creation of Human Rights Council, and it is as it's written, a fulfillment of human rights obligation and commitment based on an interactive dialogue. Now this is, when you do a review, sometimes, for example, special procedures, they have this special rapporteur asking for information. Now special rapporteur is an independent expert, personal or a working group which is independent body, but here you are being reviewed by your peers, your counterparts. So example, China was reviewed in 2006, in 2009. At that time, first China has to file a report saying that what the China has done to improve the human rights situation. At that time, they came out with the National Human Rights Plan of Action in 2009 and 10. And then the other countries, all the 193 member states, can question China and held accountable to any of the human rights issues that are within the China. And Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, other relevant stakeholders like NGOs, national human rights institutions. For example, NGOs here is the NGOs, there's a criteria for the NGOs to submit its questionnaires or reports. The NGOs are only within the scope of ECOSOC consultative status. There's NGOs which has to be the member of ECOSOC consultative, having the consultative status. Now, China's review is due in October 2013 this year. So now we will look back into the pledges or commitment made by China in 2009 and whether they have implemented those pledges or promises. Now the member states of not only the Human Rights Council but whole of UN General Assembly has the opportunity to ask China what they have done in the past, whether it has improved or worsened, the situation has worsened. For example, in case of Tibet, 2009, now 2013, the situations inside Tibet has worsened manifold. Now China's role and obligation in the UN system. Interestingly, China was one of the founding members of the United Nations, but at that time it was technically represented by the Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China and the present-day Taiwan. And till 1971, the Republic of China, the Taiwan, has taken the seat of the China, represented the China. But in 1971, UN General Assembly passed a resolution recognizing the People's PRC as the rightful representative of China in the UN and also got the permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And the Republic of China was expelled from the UN altogether. Interestingly, the UN Commission on Human Rights, which was the drafting committee of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, Peng Chung-Chang, I don't know whether I pronounced it correctly, he was the representative from China at that time, and he was one of the founding member or vice chairman of that drafting committee of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, China's active engagement within the UN. Beginning in 1971, when People's Republic of China was first brought into the UN system, the UN General Assembly, they declared all those multilateral treaties as illegal, void, and null. And this was a big setback for the global community because at that time China has ratified the ICCPR and International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. And China has always been pursuing a global reform agenda targeting West to involve more developing countries in the UN system. And they finally joined the UN Commission on Human Rights in 1982 and sent large delegation. At that time, China was wary of what's going on, whether to just jump into the human rights system or to stay back. So they have been sending huge delegation in the beginning years just as an observant. And finally, in 1982, they joined the UN Commission on Human Rights. Now, the role of China is in early 80s, it abstained on most of the resolutions of the UN. Rather than being a proactive member, it just stayed back and watched carefully. And then sometimes in 1980s they also supported country resolutions on Afghanistan and Cambodia and condemned Russia on their for aggression on these states. But at this time, since it was not systematic in their approach, it was very it's not consistent enough to make having a specific foreign policy as such. But one thing is consistent is they always oppose interference in other countries, internal affairs so they normally claim that under the pretext of human rights, don't interfere in other states' interest. Now, at that time, but still they were quite welcoming and quite receptive of the whole human rights system. But in 1989, during the Tiananmen Square killings, the United Nations and many other countries placed the arms embargo, sanctions, and passed so many resolutions. And even in 90s, with regard to Tibet, I'll touch Tibet later on. And at that time, they felt the heat of the UN human rights system. And from there on, and also the fact that from the 1990s, there was an economic reform in China, and there was huge development that has been going on in China. And then China has been started asserting itself as a global power, and at the same time cracking down on dissidents or opponents. So, but China has been that their image at the global stage is not that good in terms of human rights. So their approach to the UN human rights system has always been very participants after the late 80s or 90s. They have been coming with huge delegation in Human Rights Council, summits and listens to arguments, unlike sometimes Israel, sometimes they just back off. But then China has been very proactive in late 90s because they knew what's going to happen after, because there have been sanctions, arms embargo after during the Tiananmen Square killings. Now China's discourse in Human Rights Council have been deferred in the sense that they sometimes don't accept the universality of the human rights. Now their position has been changed a bit after the universal periodic